National 5 historians, and welcome to our next lesson in our Nazi Germany topic. This time we're looking at the economic problems of the Weimar Republic, and in particular we're thinking about the Great Depression. So we have chatted about how the Nazi Party came to be, the whole problems with hyperinflation and how that was dealt with, and the beginning of the Golden Age of Weimar. So this lesson we're thinking about how the Golden Age now ended and the impact that the Great Depression, which was one of the causes of the end of the age, actually had on Germany, and as well as that we're thinking about how the two sides responded, so how the government responded and how the Nazi Party responded. In particular, we're going to think about how their popularity started to increase during this period. So make a note of the heading and the information that you need to know and continue the lesson. So despite Germany having an apparent recovery after 1923, there were actually still some quite serious problems for them. Diplomatically, there were issues because Stressmans had attempted to revise the Treaty of Versailles, which obviously was very hated in Germany, and had not actually managed to have much success at the League of Nations. They didn't really want to revise it, they weren't willing to listen or discuss that. So that was still quite a serious problem, and there were still quite a lot of people in Germany who were very much against the Treaty of Versailles. In terms of economically, there's still problems because Germany is now very heavily dependent on the loans from the US, which could very well be recalled at any time, and that is obviously a very serious concern. Socially, there are still problems because many people's life savings have been completely wiped out by hyperinflation, and they were bitterly angry about this. And politically, Ebert had died in 1925, and he was then replaced with Hindenburg, who was a conservative leader, and really this kind of showed how much support actually did remain for the kind of old authoritarian sort of German nation that the people had maybe known, because they were willing to elect someone that was more conservative than obviously Ebert had been previous. So really the good way to remember this is, even though there were some significant recovery things that went on during the Golden Age of Weimar, after that kind of period ended, they were still a bit desperate. So D, diplomatic problems, E, economic problems, S, social problems, and P, political problems at Germany did mean that though things had improved definitely and life was looking much better, there were still some pockets of kind of desperation at the problems. And when the Golden Age ends quite abruptly, these problems are going to come to the front. So 1929, two disasters strike. On the 3rd of October 1929, Stressmans dies. He's the man that got Germany out of the economic crisis of 1923. This was a huge blow. And then the second thing happens the same month, just at the end of the month. On the 29th of October, the Wall Street crash happened, which was basically the complete collapse of the American stock market. Now, the German economy had been rebuilt on American loans, remember, and Stressmans had said they're basically dancing on a volcano. If it erupts, they're done for. And this is basically what had happened. The Wall Street crash was this eruption, and Germany had to give their money back. America was demanding that money back. As a result of this, a lot of industries and things closed, and unemployment managed to reach 6 million in 1932 in Germany. Many German people actually then turned to the extreme political parties, such as the Communist Party for some, and the Nazi Party for others, because they were now claiming that they would be able to solve these problems, and both of the parties wanted to end this democracy and solve the problems that had kind of gone along with it. And for a lot of people in Germany, what they were seeing is that all of the problems were tied to this Weimar democracy. That's how a lot of them genuinely felt. So they start to become much popular, or much more popular than they had been previously. So in terms of things we need to write down, we need to say disaster strikes, and then we need to say that Stressmans dies, and then that the Wall Street crash, and we're going to say the collapse of the American stock market, and they wanted their money back. Unemployment reached 6 million in 1932. Many Germans turned to extreme political parties, such as the Communists and the Nazis, who claimed they could solve Germany's problems. Okay, so just a quick note from that slide before we move on. So a little bit more detail about this. Obviously we're not writing this just now, we're just having a look. The death of Stressman was a huge problem for Germany because he'd obviously been the one that had sorted out the mess. When he died in October 1929, it was literally just before the second major financial crisis hit them, meaning that the Weimar government had lost their most able chancellor at the time when they really needed him most. He probably would have been able to negotiate things out and try and do something, at least that's what the people believed, but with him gone, there wasn't really anybody to take this place and take this role. In terms of the Great Depression itself, obviously the Wall Street crash actually happens, the value of the US shares collapse, the US bankers and business start recalling their loans, and it actually results in a worldwide depression. This meant disaster economically for Germany. The companies went bankrupt almost overnight, workers were sacked, poverty gripped the nation again for the first time, and it wasn't a particularly good situation. So the American loans were called back immediately, unemployment reached 6 million, and it wasn't a good situation for Germany to be in. So the reactions of the people. It's often referred to as the cut that never healed. So the German people were really genuinely afraid that hyperinflation would return, because that was something that was always in the back of their minds. It was something they were really afraid of, and when the second economic issue becomes a major issue, they are really frightened that that's what it's going to go back to. They'd gotten used to the wages and the good times that they'd had based on the US loans, and the Young Plan earlier in 1929 seemed to have secured them this, but by the end point, or October 1929, it's all falling apart, so they're quite upset about this. So you need that heading, reactions of the people. It doesn't really highlight very well, but you need that one. And we're just going to say the Germans were afraid hyperinflation would return. It was like the cut that never healed. Like that. They'd gotten used to the wages and the good times they had based on the US loans. The Young Plan early in 1929 seemed to have secured them this, but later in 1929 it was all falling apart. So, quick note from that slide before we move it on. So, we're thinking about which groups of people suffered within Germany as a result of the Wall Street crash, and it is a really good idea for you to make a copy of this mind map, just so you can kind of see each of the bits. So if you're not a mind map person, find it as a grid or just as a list under this heading and some key points. So young people, by 1933, over half of all Germans between the ages of 16 and 30 were unemployed, and 60% of new university graduates could not get a job, even with their degree. Businessmen saw their businesses close because people had less money to spend on goods. Farmers had not done well in the 1920s, prices had been falling, and they fell further into debt in the 1930s, and that was obviously not good for them at all. And then the factory workers, some lost their jobs and others' wages were cut, which made it difficult to pay rent and buy goods, and this made them worried about hyperinflation happening as well. So basically what happened is Germany was now in a worse situation than they had been in 1923, because there was actually no outside help at this point. Okay, so the groups which suffered were these ones, and the situation is actually worse in a lot of ways than it had been during hyperinflation, because there was actually no way out. The whole of the world had been plunged into this economic turmoil as a result of this. So it wasn't as if there would be another country somewhere that could bail them out, as had previously happened. Interesting picture from the time. I will be very quiet for a second or two just to kind of give you a second to look at it and see what you can actually spot. So we've got the crowds of people all in a line, and you might notice that Hitler's name is quite obvious on the side of this building here. This is the unemployed line in Hanover, and the wall has one slogan written on it: vote for Hitler. So every person in this line is unemployed. They're here to try and get some sort of benefit package, some sort of money or a job, something that they can actually do to be able to feed themselves and their families. The economic impact, obviously, that the Wall Street crash had was quite serious on unemployment. So you can kind of see on this chart here, 1921 unemployment is quite low, but it starts to rise quite significantly. Okay, so about 5%, 1925, 5% of the labour force is unemployed. It dips a little bit and then it jumps quite sharply up. And then we have the kind of the golden age period. It is definitely coming down, and then the Wall Street crash happens and it starts to climb really significantly until it gets to the point where by 1933 and 1934, between 30 to 25% of the labour force of all of Germany is actually unemployed. So, unemployment in the Nazis. Is this actually a fatal combination for Germany? Now, obviously we know the Nazi Party did not exist when the Weimar Republic was founded in 1919, yet by 1934 Hitler becomes the Führer of Germany. Now, one explanation of Hitler's rise to power, and the reason he got there, is the relationship between unemployment in Germany and the votes that the Nazi Party start to receive. So remember, after the failed putsch, he understands that he has to do it in a way that will actually mean he gets power legitimately, and he has to actually get the votes. Unemployment gave the Nazis this focus from the people, which made them more popular, which got them the votes. Or at least in some ways that's what it's believed. So, unemployment in the Nazis is a heading. Okay, and we're just going to take the note from the blue box. Was founded 1919. 1934, Hitler was Führer of Germany. One explanation of Hitler's rise to power is the relationship between unemployment, obviously we know it's in Germany, and the votes received by the Nazi Party. And what I want you to do is make a copy of this table in your jotter, leave a couple of lines in each box, and then go through the information on the next couple of slides, and then at the end I'll show you the finished version of this table that you can fill in. But so you can fill it in if you want as you go, but there will be a version at the end for you to fill in. So, May 1924, the unemployment levels in Germany are roughly about this. The number of Nazi seats that exist is roughly about this. So the economic crisis from the kind of 1923 hyperinflation point in the Weimar Republic was at its height at this point in time. Unemployment stood at 2 million, which is about 13.5%. In this context, the Nazis fought their first election and managed to achieve 32 seats in the Reichstag, which is not bad. That's about 6.7% of the total number of seats there. So this is kind of showing you at a point where it is climbing, their popularity is quite significant as well, or significantly climbing. November of 1924, what we see is this. We've got a dip in the unemployment level and therefore a dip in the Nazi seats. So when the economic crisis of the Weimar Republic was coming to an end, the hyperinflation had been brought under control, the introduction of the Rentenmark was in full swing, and unemployment had fallen by half since May to 1.2 million, which is only 6.7%. The Nazi policies then seemed to be quite extreme, much less attractive than they had seemed during a point of crisis, and they lost the seats in the Reichstag. They got 14 members, which is just under 3% of the total seats available. By May 1928, unemployment is climbing again. This is the Weimar Republic at the peak of its popularity, obviously before the Wall Street crash and Stressmans' death. People are not really thinking about hyperinflation anymore. The economy is booming. It's in the back of their mind, but they're not really focused on it. Things look good. Unemployment is staying relatively low, even though it has risen just a little bit to 10%, which is 1.5 million since 1924. It's not seen as a huge problem, and so the Nazis are basically no longer really taken much seriously. They're a spent force in the elections. They only managed to get 12 seats in the Reichstag, which is only 2% of the total seats available. Then September 1930 rolls round, and the economy of Germany is in deep depression as a result of the Wall Street crash in November 1929, end of October, November 1929, and the fact that America have recalled these loans. Unemployment has rocketed up to 3.1 million, which is 15.3%, and the Weimar politicians basically just seem to be incapable of solving the problems. We're going to talk about that in a minute. In this situation, the Nazis are starting to seem like a viable alternative again. They seem to be the way out of this problem, and as a result of that, their support starts to rise. They managed to gain 108 Reichstag seats at that election, with 18% of the total seats going to them. July of 1932, and it looks like this. So the economic depression that pretty much followed the Wall Street crash is now at its peak, July 1932. Unemployment has continued to rise and is now at 5.5 million people, which is 30.1%. The German people have now started to lose faith in democracy altogether. Communist popularity is also increasing at this point in time. They go from having 54 seats to 100 seats, but the Nazis are continuing this mass rise in popularity, and in that election they managed to get 230 seats, which is 38% of the total. In November 1932, it looks like this. The economic depression is starting to come to an end. Unemployment has started to fall, but is still quite high. It's still at 5 million, which is 27% of the population. It seems like this crisis is over, and as happened way back down here at this point, when the crisis is over, the support of the Nazis starts to fall. However, they do still remain the largest single party in the Reichstag by far, with 196 seats, which is 34% of the total seats available. And then we have March 1933. This election result obviously doesn't seem to fit the pattern that we're seeing in these previous years. Unemployment has fallen just slightly to 4.5 million or 23.3%, and the trend of this graph should show us that the Nazis should have lost more seats. So we should be seeing this symbol here down roughly about here or lower. However, in this election, March 1933, their seats in the Reichstag rose to 288 seats, or 45% of the total available. And we'll talk about why that happened in more detail. So, fill in your table then that you should have drawn in for each of the dates. You've got the number and the percentage of employment for each one. You've got the number of seats and the percentage of these for Nazi popularity, and then you've got a couple of reasons why. Okay, so pause the video and come back at about 19 and 47 seconds and continue the lesson. So reactions to the Nazis and of the Nazis then. So as times got worse for Germany, Hitler basically saw this as a chance to gain support. Okay, so can we put that heading, reactions of the Nazis, and we're just going to take a quick note. So as times got worse for Germany, Hitler saw a chance to gain support. He claimed the Nazis had all the answers to the problems and that the Weimar government was just making things worse. They opened soup kitchens, areas where people who were unemployed or were in poverty could go to get food, and food parcels. They opened food banks and things like that as well, and tried to do what they proclaimed as the best for the German people, whereas the Weimar government didn't quite manage that. Other reactions of the Nazis was through fresh propaganda, so again, stick this one down as well. The Nazis really start to use propaganda quite effectively, like political advertising, during the Great Depression era. Particularly the case when in 1932 Hitler runs for president and he comes a very, very close second to Hindenburg. There's posters put up all around Germany depicting Hitler as Germany's last hope. The slogan, Hitler is our last hope Hitler, things like that. Planes were used to help Hitler travel all over Germany to deliver his rousing speeches. The radio was used to help him reach an even wider audience and generally try to get the message that the German people needed to hear, which was that there was someone who could solve the problems. And in particular, the Nazi Party were the ones that were promising to do this. So for this one, we're going to say during the Depression, the Nazis really started to use propaganda effectively. And then our 3 points here. So posters were produced depicting Hitler as Germany's last hope. Planes were used to help him travel all over to deliver his rousing speeches, and the radio was used to help him reach an even wider audience. People tuned in quite often to hear his radio broadcasts. Other members of the Nazi Party would speak and stuff as well, but again, making sure that people could hear him all over Germany was the job of the propaganda team, and they did this really, really well. Where the government weren't really saying, here's how we're going to fix things, Hitler was in his speeches making some clear points with this is how we'll fix it. Now, it's never going to be a really clear plan, and he does spend quite a lot of it explaining to the people who's to blame and why they're to blame, but he is at least promising something, which is more than the government were doing at this point. The mastermind behind the propaganda campaign was a man called Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels was particularly a gifted person when it came to political propaganda. He's quite famous for the line, if you tell a lie, tell a big lie and tell it often, people will believe you. And that kind of represents quite nicely how the Nazi propaganda machine, as it was referred to, was used to try and encourage the people of Germany to side with the Nazi Party and with Hitler. Other things the Nazis did was through mass appeal. It was only effective in terms of propaganda if what they were doing was publicising popular policies. They came up with policies that basically appealed to ordinary, everyday German people. And it was quite simple. 1, end unemployment. Okay, Hitler promised to give jobs to everybody in Germany who had become unemployed as a result of the Depression. Massive tick. 2, tear up the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler said he would break this treaty and make Germany great again. Again, massive tick for a lot of people. And 3, blame the Jews. Hitler gave the desperate German people a scapegoat, someone who they could blame for the desperation and their defeat in 1918 and everything that had happened to them afterwards. Blame the Jews, blame the communists, and create a kind of, it's not our fault, but if these people hadn't done this, we wouldn't be in this situation sort of thing. So these 3 key points, which again you should note down because they're highlighted, were the way that the Nazis reacted and how they encouraged people to vote for them. They also introduced other fresh policies by identifying key groups in German society that he thought was important to win over, and with the help of Goebbels, the Nazi Party made sure that their messages targeted these key groups of voters. So for the people in the cities, they had the slogan "Work, Freedom and Bread," which was to convince the workers that the Nazis were focused on the needs of the working class and industrial class people, because that's what they needed. Freedom from the treaty, work because they were unemployed or needing work, and bread because they were starving as a result of being unable to afford food. For the people in the countryside, the slogan was "Blood and Soil," pretty much used to convince the rural voters that the Nazis believed that the German nation sprang up from the farming class, and actually the farmers, who had been more or less kind of stomped into the ground a little bit since 1925, really took this on board because it felt like someone was actually acknowledging them for the first time. You could maybe think about a slogan the Nazis could have used to win the votes for women. If you want to pop that into the team, could be worth a good discussion. You don't obviously have to do that, but if you have a burning slogan that the Nazis could have used to target German women at this point in time, then feel free to put it in and explain why you've picked it, or just put it in and we can have a chat about that. But take a note of the bits that are highlighted and then move on. So we can see the Nazis are responding really, really well to this crisis. However, the Weimar Republic did not respond well. Okay, so while the Nazis did well, and obviously my highlighting is terrible, but you know to write that down because I have attempted to highlight it. So while the Nazis did really, really well, the Weimar Republic did not. In spring 1930, President Hindenburg appointed Heinrich Brüning as Chancellor. This is him here. Okay, for the next 2 years, for the majority of it, between 1930 and 1932, he ruled without ever getting agreement of a majority of politicians in the Reichstag. And we call this ruling by decree. This was allowed due to the way that the Weimar Republic had been set up and due to Article 48. It was supposed to help, but actually only aided in Hitler's rise to power, because the Nazi Party were able to say, obviously, the Weimar Republic are taking control and they're not letting people have their voices heard, which annoyed some people. But also later on, when Hitler becomes Chancellor, it means there's precedent for him to actually do the same thing and start to make rules and things by decree as a result of Article 48 that can't be stopped by the Reichstag. And then ultimately that leads to the dictatorship once Hindenburg dies. So again, I know there's a lot to write on this, but quick note from the bullet points here. Again, feel free to shorten them if you want to for your notes, but that information is important. Also from Weimar, in terms of reaction, we had indecision. By 1932, the government was literally changing almost every few months. The parties could not agree on how to actually deal with issues or what the actual immediate concern with issues were. The economy was in ruins, unemployment is rising, and the politicians just seem to be ignoring all of the ideas that the Weimar Constitution and democracy is based on by decreeing rather than allowing democracy to actually happen and people to have a say. As a result of this, the German people lose what little faith they actually have in this new democracy. So the parties keep changing, they can't agree on how to deal with issues. The politicians seem to be ignoring the very ideas the Weimar Constitution and democracy was based on, and many lost faith in their government and democracy altogether. The government reactions at this time included things like reducing public spending, cutting pensions for older people and war widows, which obviously all led to anger. And some of the governments actually collapsed because they couldn't move forwards or backwards on any decisions, and as a result dissolved the Reichstag, and it had to be then re-elected, which gave the Nazis a chance to actually get more seats. So this was a major issue for them at this time. So the only actions they actually did manage to do was negative things, reducing public spending and cutting pensions for older people and war widows, and it all led to German anger. And we've kind of already said that the government didn't work well together, but we can also say the governments collapsed because they could not agree. One source in particular from an American historian called William Schreier in 1959 is kind of talking about these problems, and he says the weakness of the Weimar regime were obvious. There were too many political parties, and they were unable to form an enduring majority in the Reichstag that could back a stable government. By 1932, political power was concentrated in the hands of a senile president and in those of a few shallow, ambitious men around him. Hitler saw this clearly, and it suited his purposes. So the situation was good for Hitler at that point in time. He goes on to say economic problems nearly always produced political problems because governments suddenly find themselves having to deal with difficult problems, and that's what happened in Germany after the Wall Street crash of 1929. The coalition governments in Germany found it difficult to agree on how to help Germany through the massive economic crisis of the Depression. This led the president to use Article 48 more and more often, so that Germany became run more by dictatorship than democracy. This crisis helped Hitler to gain the second most important job in Germany in 1933, which was Chancellor of Germany, and this would eventually lead to Germany being ruled completely by dictatorship. So this slide is really, really important as a nice kind of wee summary from this point down. I know it's quite a bit of writing on this one, but we're going to take this as a note because it is an important way to summarise what we've kind of just been talking about and why it had this impact and why it was important. Okay, so pause that and take a note from this slide. This is a really good kind of table to have as well. You can kind of see what they're talking about with this. So in 1930 we have the decrees that are issued using Article 48, where the president doesn't have to ask anybody and can just do. There's only 5. The times that the Reichstag actually sits to make decisions is 94. A year later there are 44 decrees being issued using Article 48, and the Reichstag is only sitting 41 times. And in the year after that there are 60 decrees being issued by Article 48, and the Reichstag is only sitting 13 times. So it seems like with this column going up and this column going down, it is becoming more and more like a dictatorship. Now, if you want to copy this table into your notes underneath that wee summary we just wrote, as an example, you can. If you don't want to, that is totally fine as well. Basically, what we're then saying is the economic impact leads to extremism. When you see 1928, and we've got all of the kind of major parties here, the major kind of extremist parties are this red bloc and the Nazi yellow bloc there. The Social Democrats are the ones in power, and things kind of go quite well for them. When 1930 hits, these extremist parties skyrocket up, whereas these parties start to kind of go up a little bit and mostly do stay the same. However, by 1932, these parties are starting to come down, whereas the extremists are definitely going up. And it does dip ever so slightly in November of 1932 when things seem to be getting better. However, by the end, in March 1933, when Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany, you can see that the popularity and the seats in the Reichstag for the Nazi Party is at the highest compared to all of the other groups and parties that are there. This is when we watched Rise of Evil, and Hindenburg offered Hitler the vice-chancellorship as a way to kind of placate him. He refused it, and he said, the popularity of my party demands much more than third place, and he wanted the chancellorship. And Hindenburg said, no, this is kind of where we're at. This is why his popularity is so high, he's demanding the chancellorship, and ultimately he will get the chancellorship, as we saw, and we will go into a wee bit in more detail with that. But you can kind of see how, as the political situation and the economic situation gets worse, the economic impact has a political impact, and that is why Hitler and the Nazi Party start to become more popular. So the end of the Golden Age. Could the government have done more to help? Definitely. Why didn't they then? Economically, it was actually really scared of raising the unemployment benefits to cover all of these people in case it led to hyperinflation happening. Remember, the cut that never healed, definitely in the forefront of the politicians' minds. So they definitely don't want that to happen. So economically, it was scared of raising unemployment benefits in case this led to hyperinflation again. And what would they do then? Politically, it was unable to take decisive actions because proportional representation produced weak coalition governments which were unable to agree on a common policy together, and nothing got done. The government's lack of action helped the Nazis become the largest party in the Reichstag and did set a precedent for a potential dictatorship in the future. Finally, many historians believe that the Depression was the key factor which led to the Nazis taking power. Famous quote from A.G.P. Taylor said it was the Great Depression, or the depression that put the wind in Hitler's sails. William Carr, another historian, he says it was inconceivable that the Nazis would have gained power without it. So without the Great Depression, and without the weaknesses of the Weimar government and their reactions to this economic crisis, it is unlikely that Hitler and the Nazis would have come to power when they did. However, the situation was right for them, and they did come to power as a result of these things.